Okay, I think we're going to get started. So, hello everyone. Welcome to tonight's presentation on the role of disturbances in enhancing Nebraska's wetland ecosystem. My name is Lauren Smith, and I'm an AmeriCorps member serving with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public through supporting communities and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects to address local conservation concerns like tonight's webinar. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, there are a few rules to go over. For those joining online, your cameras will remain off and you will be muted throughout the presentation. Please type any questions you have in the chat or the Q&A section, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation. Following the presentation, we will have a very brief survey that should only take less than a minute to complete. This survey helps support programming like this one, so we very much greatly appreciate you taking the time to fill those out. Tonight, we welcome Ted LaGrange, who is the Wetland Program Manager for the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. Ted received his master's in wildlife biology from Iowa State University, after which he became a waterfowl technician for the Iowa Department of Natural Resources for 8 years, and he has been serving as Wetland Program Manager for Nebraska Game and Parks Commission for 32 years, which is quite the achievement. So Ted, I think I'll hand it off to you, if that's all right.
Yes, thank you, Lauren, and great to be here this evening, and thanks to everyone who's able to join. So we'll go ahead and share my presentation that I'll go through. See if we can get everything to work here. Okay. All right, are you seeing that, Lauren?
Yeah, we're all good.
All right, so well, as Lauren said, I work for Nebraska Game and Parks. I'm the Wetland Program Manager, cover the whole state of Nebraska, and work on kind of all things wetland related in the conservation realm. So really pleased to be with you tonight to talk about a subject that's near and dear to my heart and career, which is wetlands and wetlands of Nebraska. So first off, I'm always amazed at the diversity of wetlands that Nebraska has. As Lauren said, I went to Iowa State. I'm actually from Iowa originally, but have worked in Nebraska for over 30 years and just have been in awe of the amazing diverse types of wetlands that we have across the state of Nebraska. So really fun to work in all of these different types throughout the state. And they support a huge array of biodiversity, different kinds of fish and wildlife and plants that are really important to our state. And I do want to give a shout out here to, I will talk a little bit later about Platte Basin time lapse and the amazing outreach products that we worked on creating. And so some of the really neat photographs in the presentation are from the producers at the Platte Basin time lapse, including all of these. So I wish I was half the photographer that they are. They do just some amazing work, and you'll be the beneficiary of seeing some of their photos as well as some from our Nebraska Land Magazine staff tonight. So, and wetlands, most importantly, provide benefits to people, and those benefits are everything from whether you're a duck hunter or like outdoor recreation and bird watching, education, or involved in agriculture. Wetlands are an important provider of benefits for all kinds of different people in the state of Nebraska. And maybe most importantly, they're really important for our water quality and quantity. And I'll touch on the benefits of wetlands a little bit before I get into the disturbance dynamics and talk a little bit about those things here in Nebraska. So the water quantity and quality are super important to everyone in the state. We all rely on clean and plentiful water for our livelihoods, and so that's a super important benefit that these wetlands can provide. So what I'm going to cover tonight is just, and some of if you've seen a webinar from me before, this might be a little bit of a repeat, but I'd like to assume that you're maybe not super familiar with everything wetland wise. So I'm going to describe what a wetland is, share again a little more detail, including the water quality aspect of why wetlands are important, talk about how we made some alterations that haven't been for the best for those wetlands, We'll do a quick tour of the different wetland types around the state. Then I'll get into talking about wetland disturbance and dynamics and how they influence the conservation measures and actions we're taking to improve wetlands in Nebraska. And finally, we'll wrap up just making you aware of some of the innovative wetland outreach materials that are available online, and we'll share a link to those so you can explore those on your own time when you get a chance. So this is a definition of a wetland. It's both in federal law and also in state law. Pretty simple, a couple of sentences, and I've underlined a couple of key factors. So for an area to be a wetland, it has to have water, obviously, either at the surface, like ponded above the water, or groundwater near the surface. So think of wet meadows that are maybe saturated, wet prairie type areas. They also have to have plants that are adapted to growing in wet conditions, and they have to have soils that take on characteristics of having developed under these wet conditions. So that's a simple definition of what a wetland is. I teach a whole course on how to delineate or identify the boundaries of wetlands, which is important for legal aspects, development and things like that might happen. But tonight we're not going to go into all those detail, but just suffice it to say that's the definition. And then this diagram is a nice one because it lines up that aspect of if you have the vegetation, the soils, and the hydrology, that is the water, ponded or saturated, that you will have a wetland. And all three of those have to be present for an area to be considered a wetland. And if you just have one of those or even two, that does not make it a wetland. And again, that's important from a legal perspective. I'll touch this briefly on, we do have some laws that do protect wetlands, and that's why we need this kind of a definition that can be defended. So, but when we talk about the benefits to society, I touched on that already just a little bit. Certainly improving water quality, reduce flooding and soil loss. Wetlands help supply water by recharging our groundwater. They produce food and fiber, primarily hay in Nebraska that's used for livestock. They are excellent places to sequester carbon, and they provide amazing habitat for fish, wildlife, and plants, and then provide places for recreation and education. And so just covering those things a little bit more detail, thinking of wetlands like a sponge. And so that can help with the flooding. So the water that's held up in a wetland is not going to cause as much damage downstream when we have a flood event. Wetlands are great filters. They clean contaminated water, including removing things like nitrates, which are a big concern in Nebraska, and also many of our other water pollutants. And then again, providing food to humans and animals are some of the things that wetlands do, the services or benefits they provide. And when we think about it from a wildlife standpoint, again, my background is as a wildlife biologist. There are amazing places for biodiversity, as I've already touched on, including habitat for endangered and threatened species. And then they give us great places, green spaces, places to go and recreate and to get out into nature. And so that's really important to have those spaces available to us to just to get out and enjoy nature. So I'll share a link to a guide to Nebraska wetlands. This information is in that, so you can get the details later. I'll share you the web link to that. But if we look at the biodiversity in wetlands, about 50% of our plants, 100% of our amphibians, about a third of our mammals and reptiles, and about 50% of our birds use wetlands for some important part of their life cycle. So wetlands are super productive systems. Again, for a small footprint they have on the landscape, super important for our biodiversity in the state. And I mentioned the endangered and threatened species we have, both on the state list. We have a state list of endangered and threatened species and a federal list. And basically about 75% of those species rely on wetlands for key parts of their life cycles, including things like the western prairie fringed orchid shown here and also whooping cranes. So super important when we talk conservation of fish and wildlife and plants. We want to talk a little bit about how our landscape's been altered over the last 150 plus years. So when the first settlers, predominantly from Europe, started settling the area we now call Nebraska, they viewed the wetlands here as kind of unlimited. And the wetlands were probably an impediment to, if you're trying to put a road in or build your town or city or put in farmland. And so they started converting those wetlands and didn't probably realize that they could do such an amazing job and really alter the landscape in a significant way, creating some pretty high loss levels in some places in Nebraska that I'll touch on. So they did this a variety of ways, dumping fill material into wetlands, putting underground tile lines in that drain that subsurface water away. We've altered many of our streams and rivers by dams and straightening and ditches. And we've even put things like drainage tunnels in that take water away from a wetland and route it to a stream that might be even several miles away. So lots of ways that wetlands have been altered in Nebraska. This is a GIS image I created out in the Holdridge and Axtell area, kind of south of Kearney. And it really shows how altered that landscape is. What I put here is anything in row crop, predominantly corn and soybeans, is in yellow. Center pivots or circles, groundwater wells are the blue dots. Excavated features like ditches and pits to drain wetlands are in that red. So you can see very few wetlands remaining, and they're pretty well surrounded in this landscape, especially by agriculture. And it creates challenges for us in dealing with the conservation, but I'll talk about how we work to address some of those challenges with those alterations. And not only have we altered the landscape, but we have continuing ongoing threats, sedimentation coming off either urban areas or agricultural areas. We continue to alter our streams. Direct drainage and filling can still happen in wetlands. I'm going to touch on the dynamics and the need for wetland management. If we don't manage them, especially because we have some of those invasive species, we can have real problems with having the wetlands be their optimal, provide their optimal amount of benefits. So when we think things like sedimentation, we have here as a crop field that comes right up into a rainwater basin wetland. And so they're farming, right up to the edge of the wetland here. The wetland itself has some wetland vegetation in it, and that can lead to this sedimentation. So it's a threat, even though the wetland maybe hasn't been drained. Every rain event you get a little sediment, a little soil running off the uplands down into the wetlands and can really alter those. So it's one of the challenges we deal with, and I'll touch on how we kind of deal with that in planning our restoration work and conservation work we do for wetlands in the state. So we have some invaders, some invasive species that some we didn't historically have, like purple loosestrife or Phragmites, hybrid cattail, reed canary grass. They've altered the genetics of. It's super aggressive. And then trees, we certainly have mostly native trees, but in some of our prairie type wetlands, because we've altered the disturbances I'll talk about in a bit, those wetlands are, again, if it's a prairie wetland, those trees can be considered invasive, and we work to try to remove those and reestablish, native prairie type vegetation in those kinds of wetlands. So I'm going to do a quick run around the state, just kind of giving you an overview of some of the diverse types of wetlands we have in Nebraska. This map is from the Guide to Nebraska Wetlands. Again, we'll share a link to that later. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold too, so bear with me at times. So I'll talk about riverine wetlands. Probably some of our most abundant wetlands or widespread wetlands certainly are associated with every river and stream, have these fringe areas that are wet or receive flood water and are wetland kind of areas. And so the Platte River is, of course, an amazing river flowing across Nebraska, has a lot of amazing wetlands associated with the river, including wet meadows and like the sloughs you see off to the right side of this image that provide an important habitat for a lot of different wildlife species. And so we have amazing wetlands associated with all of our rivers, the Elkhorn, Niobrara, Missouri. And like I say, every stream in every county has some wetlands associated with it. So again, probably our most widespread wetland type are the riverine or stream type wetlands. Our largest amount of wetlands are actually in the sandhills. It's where we have the least alteration of wetlands because of the sandhills being pretty intact. As hard to grow row crops up in that landscape. So it's mostly privately owned rangeland. And the ranchers in that landscape, and many of who I know personally and work with, are amazing stewards of the water and the grass resources that they have in the sandhills. So we have an area in Nebraska that's 20,000 square miles of intact uh, prairie with over 1 million acres of wetlands peppered in amongst the sandhills. So really amazing wetland resource available there. They have some amazing, unique types of wetlands, highly salty or alkali wetlands out in the western part of the sandhills. And then we have some areas that get regional groundwater discharge, and you get thick peat or organic matter buildup, sometimes 20 feet deep or more. And these create fen type wetlands that have some unique glacial relic species that are found in the sandhills around these fen areas. In the next nearest place you'll find them in places like northern Minnesota. So a really unique gem of a thing we have in Nebraska, nestled in the sandhills in some special places. So again, the ranch land there, historically grazed by bison and elk. Now ranchers run predominantly cattle. Some do run some bison on their property as well, but predominantly cattle. And the cattle are pretty compatible with the wetlands and the prairie in the Nebraska sandhills. Have some unique wetland species up there as well. This is a Blanding's turtle. It loves the marsh type wetlands in the Nebraska sandhills. Blanding's turtles are pretty well on the threatened and endangered list in all the states around us, but we have a very thriving population in the sandhills. Again, thanks to the amazing wetland resources that we have present in that amazing landscape. A much more agricultural landscape are our playa type wetlands, and playas, so the sandhills are connected to the Ogallala Aquifer, those wetlands. Playas are perched above the Ogallala Aquifer and actually help to recharge it, but they're on these flatter areas that are predominantly crop ground, fairly circular, as you can see with this one. In these crop settings, they regularly get farmed through, but you get a heavy rain, they fill with water and provide some amazing biodiversity, as well as really important points of groundwater recharge to the Ogallala Aquifer. This is a picture of Air Lake south of Hastings in what we call our rainwater basin. Rainwater basins internationally recognized as important to migrating waterfowl. We get 10 to 12 million ducks and geese using that landscape when we have water on it during the spring migration. So that'll be happening here soon. Just an amazingly important resource for kind of providing these rest stops, kind of like their convenience stores for these long distance migrating waterfowl that use the rainwater basins, playa type wetlands to refuel for their migration journey further to the north. As well, we have whooping cranes. They winter down in Texas. They nest up in the far parts of northern Saskatchewan and Alberta. And they migrate through and use our playa type wetlands, as well as sandhills, Platte River, and some of our other wetland types in Nebraska. And these are some playa wetlands that are near in Custer County, up near the town of Broken Bow and Arnold, that area. You can see these little circular pockets of wetland out there. Whooping cranes use these, shorebirds. This is a stilt sandpiper that uses these wetlands during migration. This is a bird that winters down in the South America and nests up in the Arctic. And so a huge migrational journey it does every year. And we have the joy of watching it stop off and use some of our wetlands here in Nebraska. So the conservation of what we do here in Nebraska affects these species that are of international significance. I'll show this a little later when I talk about dynamics. This is a toad that's a woodhouse toad that's nestled into a playa type wetland. I'll talk about their adaptations in just a little bit when we talk about disturbance dynamics in wetlands. Out in the far western part of the state along the North Platte River, you can see Chimney Rock pictured there. We have what we call our western alkali wetlands. They're along the North Platte River, get a salty crust on them. So the pictures you see on the bottom, that's an avocet that's nesting in a salt encrusted and saltgrass area. And then on the right, that fence line, that's not snow, that's all alkali salts along those wetlands. So again, out near Chimney Rock and out to the Wyoming border, some really unique types of wetlands there. Closer to home here in Lincoln, we have the eastern saline wetlands. They're one of our most restricted and imperiled natural communities, located only in and around Lincoln. And they get this salty crust on them as well. And that salty crust is actually what led to the formation of the city of Lincoln, where it's at, because salt was a very valuable commodity in the mid and late 1800s. And so a place like Lincoln that had abundant salt marshes, people came and would scrape the surface of these wetlands and barrel up the salt. And we're exporting hundreds of thousands of barrels of salt to other markets because salt was a very valuable commodity before we had refrigeration. And so a unique thing, a lot of people don't realize that Lincoln was founded because of these saline wetlands that are located in and around the city. Harbor some unique plant species. One in the foreground there that kind of is thick and looks kind of like a pickle. They call it pickleweed. That's Salicornia or saltwort. It's on our state endangered list. And the grass pictured there is saltgrass. And then this is the Salt Creek tiger beetle, which is on the federal and state endangered list. Probably one of the most imperiled animals in the world, where we have populations of just a few hundred individuals, and they're only found in the saline wetlands right around Lincoln. And then we just have wetlands throughout the state, as I mentioned. Every county, every community has wetlands associated with it. And so they provide these amazing benefits, amazing green spaces, and tremendous biodiversity that we need to do everything we can to conserve and then bring back these wetlands in places where we can and are able to do that. We'll switch now and talk about wetland dynamics. So I will say that wetlands out here on the Great Plains are very dynamic. And dynamic, we mean that wetting and drying and different disturbances that happen in those wetlands. So I think it even bears repeating these wetlands are dynamic and they undergo these changes that they're well adapted to. So when we talked about some of the alterations, things like filling and tiling and ditching, those are things wetlands can't recover from unless we go in and do active restoration. The dynamics I'm talking about are natural cycles that happen, and that again, the wetland plants and animals are really well adapted to. So if you think about wetland in Nebraska, historically out here on the plains, mostly prairie, we do have some naturally forested wetlands in the east along the Missouri River and Lower Platte River, but predominantly was a prairie landscape with these wetlands that would dry up, showing kind of the mud flat there. Herds of bison and elk going through them. Fire that we know burned the prairie would also burn through those wetlands. And so you had flooding and drought, you had grazing, you had fire effects on those wetlands. And I often, when we talk about maybe what the wetlands out here on the Great Plains looked like, I think that they might have looked a lot like what the Serengeti looks like today in Africa. You know, you see pictures of watering holes, you know, the trampled down by all the different wild animals, but surrounded by a prairie type landscape. And that's probably very similar to what the wetlands in Nebraska historically were like. But again, we've altered and taken away many of those disturbances. So one of them is drying out. So drought happens in Nebraska. It's a natural part of the climate cycle. So a wetland dries out, and you can see here we got cracked mud, but some real magic happens when you have one of these dry periods, in that the bottom of the wetland, wetland soils here get exposed to sunlight, get exposed to oxygen. There's some decomposition of the carbon that happens, and it creates an ideal setting for germination of plants. Most of our wetland plants do not germinate underwater. They actually germinate when we have these dry periods during droughts every 5, 10, 20 years. And when that happens, you get this flush of vegetation that germinates. So this is that mud flat after get a little bit of maybe rain or moisture on it. You get all these seeds germinating, And that sets the stage for the plants to get reestablished and hold in there until, the next drought happens, and then the cycle repeats itself. So they're very cyclic and adapted to, again, these wetting and drying cycles. And then mentioned earlier, and in that graphic as well, we had historic grazers, bison certainly. These are some bison up on the Turner Ranch in the Sand Hills. Historically, we had bison across the state. We also had large herds of elk, and elk would certainly use these wetland areas. And as I mentioned, we're all familiar with prairie fire. Those prairie fires certainly burned through the wetlands, especially when the wetlands were dried out. And so, there was this dynamic of wetting and drying, grazing, fire, and it was all interacting, and the plants and animals were really well adapted to that. And so when we talk about disturbances, I use this in a UNL class I talk to, because we can talk about fire, grazing, sediment, flooding, and you can talk about it being good or bad. Here, I'm going to use a fire one, but fire can be good in the sense of rejuvenating the prairie and the prairie type wetlands, but clearly it can be bad as well. So lots of times the public, when they hear fire, grazing, flood, drought, they go to the negative things that the news certainly covers, which can be catastrophic, but there can be good uses of fire, grazing, flooding, drought that are part of the natural cycle, and something that wetlands certainly need to be their most productive. So this is a great diagram that was in Ducks Unlimited magazine. I think it really shows well the dynamics of wetlands across years and across the season. So this is just kind of showing one hypothetical wetland and how it can change with, again, rain events, grazing events. And some years you maybe have a bunch of ducks or wildlife on it, others not as many. But if you didn't have this natural cycle of disturbance and dynamics happening, you would not have as productive a wetland as you would by having these different disturbances come through. Excuse me. We often get questions about, well, what happens to the wildlife when these disturbances happen, and especially drought, when wetlands dry up. And certainly some things are able to move around. Obviously, birds can fly and move and find suitable habitat in other places. So can some of our insects. This is a damselfly. We also have dragonflies that not only move among wetlands, but also are long distance migrants, kind of like monarch butterflies. A lot of people don't realize that our dragonflies migrate from some species from the wetlands here down to the Gulf Coast and spend the winter there. So there's this dynamic happening of wildlife that's mobile and able to move and adapt to these disturbances. But then there are things that can't move as much. And certainly here I show this picture of the woodhouse toad again. Pretty amazing. Some of our frogs and toads will estivate, will dig down into the mud, and will sit there for more than a year, sometimes multiple years, waiting for rain to refill that wetland. And when that happens, they dig themselves back out, and they have a quick reproductive cycle. They lay their eggs, they have the tadpoles develop into adults. The adults live for a while, breed, and then when the wetland dries back up, they go back into the mud and wait till the next wet cycle. And some of our insects and other wetland invertebrates do that as well. Either they estivate, they go down into the mud and wait, or they have eggs that are well adapted to dry conditions. So pretty amazing that, I've been to wetlands that I know have been dry for 4 or 5 years. You get a big rain and I go out there and they're covered with birds. You'd expect that. But then there's dragonflies and there's frogs and there's aquatic invertebrates and toads. And all this life just comes back in those wetlands. And it's really phenomenal to see, the amazing dynamics of how these plants and animals are adapted to the disturbance dynamics we have in Nebraska wetlands. Well, I had some pictures that show that. I think I'm really pleased with this time-lapse video that Platte Basin Time-Lapse put together. This is along the Platte River, a wet meadow, wetland type area on a place called Mormon Island, just south of Grand Island. And hopefully I'll get the video to work. And it's one camera looking across this wetland. You'll kind of see a dead tree off in the back, that can be a marker for you. There's no audio with this, and it covers about a 3-year span. And it's just amazing to me. It shows this wetting, drying. You'll see cattle come through. You'll see a fire. You'll see, snow. You'll see rain events. You'll see, of course, sandhill cranes coming through it. And so to have all that life, like the sandhill cranes that many of us will be going out and enjoying during their migration here in a few weeks, the dynamics of these wetlands are kind of what makes that all possible. And again, there's no audio with this. Just watch the video. So yeah, if you took, again, to me, that just shows better than any other slides or anything I could tell you, just that watching that series of time-lapse images they captured just shows that amazing dynamic. And if you were to grab, do a screen capture of any one of those images and show several of them to some person, they'd probably say these are different, totally different places. One has water and cranes and the other is totally dry or covered with snow. And it's just does a really good job of showing these dynamics in the wetlands out here on the Great Plains of Nebraska. So start to wrap up here talking about wetland conservation. So we've talked about where wetlands are and their benefits and in this dynamic that we have to take into account. And so when we deal with wetland conservation programs, we do have some regulations and community programming, planning. Again, I have a whole hour long talk I could give you about wetland regulations. Won't get into that here, but we do have the Clean Water Act. We have aspects of the Farm Bill. So farmers who are in the farm programs have to comply to certain provisions to conserve wetlands. We do have state law that helps protect some wetlands. And maybe bigger than any of those anymore is just local community efforts. Community planning and zoning departments can do a lot to help with wetland conservation and address wetlands in their planning efforts. We do have efforts that many of our partners have to help conserve wetlands, to own some, but and these are amazing areas and provide some great public spaces. But most of Nebraska is privately owned. 97% of 97, I think, percent of our wetlands are under private ownership. So if we're going to affect conservation of these in a place like Nebraska, we have to be able to work with farmers and ranchers and recreational landowners, and we do have programs to do that and help deliver conservation on those landscapes as well. And finally, since we have so many alterations, we do a lot of restoration work through grants that we get. And this quick slide here showing our Jackson Wildlife Area. It's a saline wetland up by Ceresco, north of Lincoln. So here's the pre-restoration. So there were ditches and road ditches and things that took the saline waters away. And this is after we used a series of grants from NRCS and the Nebraska Environmental Trust and others to restore the wetlands on that floodplain. So you can see with this restored, a lot more flood storage capability, a lot more water filtering capability, and a lot more wildlife habitat present because of the conservation efforts that were done there. And so we recognize the need for long-term management. I talked about the disturbance dynamics. So knitting it all together, you can't just leave these alone. You have to understand the dynamics and try to introduce grazing, control invasive species, introduce fire when and where appropriate. And then finally, there's a lot we don't know about our wetlands in the state. There's thousands of different species. There's all this dynamic that I talked about. So ongoing science is really critical. So research that's ongoing or hopefully be done in the future will help future people in my position be able to make better decisions on how to best conserve wetlands across the state. And we do a lot with partnerships. Just touch on that briefly. There's a series of these that I have the privilege of being involved with. This is one that works on the saline wetlands. So the city of Lincoln's represented on that, the Lower Platte South Natural Resources District, Pheasants Forever, and Nebraska Game and Parks. And so this group collectively has done a lot to conserve saline wetlands. There's groups working on the Platte River and the Sand Hills, on the Missouri River, along the Rainwater Basin, out in our Playa wetlands, doing similar things. So amazing what the different conservation organizations and agencies collectively can get accomplished in Nebraska when we all work together and collaborate. And finally, just wrap up and make mention to you of some of these products. I mentioned that some films available and some publications. And this was part of a Wetlands of Nebraska project we did from 2019 to 2022, and produced a series of products that are specifically about Nebraska to make people better aware of the importance of wetlands and the things that are going on for their conservation. And so this is just a list of the things that are available. I'll share the website here in just a moment. So I'd encourage you to go look there. There's some amazing films that the Platte Basin Time Lapse crew did, 5 of them: Sandhills, Playas, Saline, Riverine, and Urban. There's a couple of really cool publications. If any of you are educators, there's some a kids magazine. There's also an educator guide and a couple of education videos specifically tailored to meet the education standards and to be used by teachers to teach about the wetlands of Nebraska, so students can become aware of the amazing diversity of wetlands we have in the state and the importance of those wetlands. So again, the website on that is, we have a domain name called nebraskawetlands.com. It's much easier to remember than if you go to all the Game and Parks address, but it's a Game and Park site. It's our wetland page, so nebraskawetlands.com. The publications there, like the Guide to Wetlands, kids booklet about about wetlands, and then there's like a YouTube playlist that has all the films. You can just click on them, play them when you get a chance. Really some cool stories that are shared on those films, and would encourage you to check that resource out. So again, this is what the page looks like when you get there. It's our wetland page, nebraskawetlands.com. And with that, we'll wrap up here and share that website once again. There's a QR code you can scan as well if you'd like to do that. And happy to answer any questions, Lauren, however you want to handle the questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Ted.
Lauren, sorry, real quick. I'm gonna launch the poll.
Here, you want me to stop? I'll stop share. There you go.
You can do whatever. So yeah, we're gonna send out the brief survey. So if you could please take a minute to fill that out, it really helps us with any programming we have right now. And we would greatly appreciate it. And then if you want to pop any questions you guys have in the chat, we're happy to answer any of them. Heather's already saying this was very informative. Thank you. I would have to agree.
Thank you. There's your chance. I'm happy to answer any questions as best I can. So.
Melissa is asking, what is your favorite Nebraska wetland, Ted?
Hi, Melissa. That's a good question. I get that a lot, and it's kind of like, what's my favorite kid or grandkid, right? I can't answer, but but I do get asked that, and to be honest, and it's an honest answer, I don't have a favorite in the sense of one type of wetland. What I really love is the diversity of wetlands we have, and then what Lauren kind of asked me to cover, which was kind of the dynamics, because I find them really interesting to visit from year to year or season to season, and how different they can be. And so the Rainwater Basin during the waterfowl migration is amazing. The Platte River clearly during crane migration, the sandhills are an amazing place. The salines are so unique. The stuff going on the Missouri River, it's just it's kind of all pretty amazing. So I'll take a pass on the favorite wetland and just say I love them all, but I do love the diversity and the dynamics, and I think that's what draws me to them. So.
And then Paula is asking, what are wet meadows?
Sure, great question. So wet meadows, I use that term and didn't describe it. My apologies, but there are areas I mentioned that wetlands can have water ponded above the surface, where you have to wade through it. Wet meadows, most of the water is down in the root zone of the plants, but it's saturated. So, like if you dug a hole in a wet meadow within the upper 12 inches or so, you're going to have water filling into that hole. So, groundwater is really close to the surface and it creates a meadow habitat, a grassland, prairie type habitat, but it's a type of wetland. And so, when you have that combination of high groundwater, so you have that saturation, so they're super productive. A lot of our hay ground along the Platte River, a lot of the valleys and the sand hills, those are actually wet meadows that they're cutting hay on because they can get their equipment across them because there's a plant root mass there that kind of holds up equipment, and they're super productive. They grow lots of grasses and other plants and provide like nutritional livestock forage. And then there's some wildlife, including cranes, that really love to use the wet meadow areas. So.
And then Heather is asking in the chat, is there a way to create a small wetland space in her own backyard? She lives in Kearney.
Yeah, I mean, people do that. We did one at our office at Game and Parks. Kearney High School helped create a wetland by their new high school out west of town. Yeah, it's going to be generally it's going to be kind of an artificial or created wetland. Most of us don't have, a hydric soil, a wetland soil in our backyard. We can just restore a wetland, but it doesn't mean you can't put in a site that um, has some wetland characteristics. So you might have to put a liner in to pond or hold that water up and then plant, I'd recommend, some native vegetation. That's what we did. We put a liner in at Game and Parks and then we planted it with native vegetation. And it's a small area, but, there's dragonflies and frogs and we have some ducks on it. And so it, makes a pretty cool part of the landscaping.
I actually have a question. I know obviously you want to conserve wetlands statewide, but is there like a specific place that you target your conservation efforts, or anywhere you can
No,
do conservation is where you go?
That's a good question. We do certainly some, opportunistically, if someone comes to us, we try to help them, but because wetlands can be important, anywhere. But we do have some areas we prioritize, and that's some of these partnerships I mentioned. We have, and some of these predate, and some are a result of something called some of the people might be familiar with our Nebraska Natural Legacy Plan. And so it highlights areas in the state we can at best conserve biodiversity, including for wetlands and wetland wildlife. So we do look at things like what is the importance of these wetlands to biodiversity, to threatened and endangered species, to maybe migrating wildlife of international significance, whooping cranes and things like that. So we do have areas that we certainly put more resources in, have these partnerships working on. In some other areas where maybe that's not happening, it doesn't mean we can't do anything there, but we're going to prioritize our people and some of our granting funds to some of these priority areas. So.
Any other last questions anyone wants to throw in the chat or the Q&A? Just a reminder to fill out the survey if we don't have any more questions. I think that concludes our webinar for tonight. If you haven't gotten a chance, like I just said, please fill out the survey that was launched. We would greatly appreciate it if you took the time to fill it out. If you want to share this with someone who wasn't able to attend tonight, or if you want to watch it again, this webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel in the near future with all of our past webinars. Thank you so much for attending tonight's webinar and learning more about Nebraska's wetlands. And most importantly, thank you to Ted for his presentation and giving us his time and talent. Have a great rest of your night, everyone. Thank you so much, Ted.
You bet. Happy to do it. So
Have a good rest of your night.
yeah, you too. Thank you. And happy to help anytime. So